Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here. Before we get started, I'd like to once again thank my members for supporting the channel and allowing me to create this content. Right, today I'm going to be really picking up a bit of a follow-on from the last discussion video, and in that we were talking about the Prime Directive, and I made an aside to say that basically one of the areas in which the Prime Directive, the many areas in which the Prime Directive goes out the window, is when they come across a pleasure planet, be that whatever that was in Wolf in the Fold, or Risa, or the Edo, and they just like, Prime Directive be damned, we're beaming down and partaking in that stuff, in some free love. So this is going to be discussing the realism of such cultures, societies. Are they plausible? What would a race or a society or a culture look like if that was their culture? If they were, as Bones put it, a totally hedonistic society, Jim. Okay, what would that actually look like? And what would the creatures that would form that look like? So, here we go. This is going to be an interesting one. So, one thing I think, a presupposition to make, is that essentially culture and cultural norms are informed by biology. Now, controversial point to some, but I think to anyone with an ounce of sense and who just looks at the world can see that for the most part, cultural norms are ultimately underpinned by a biological reality. So you might say, well, we've kind of had hedonistic societies or hedonistic cultures here on Earth, and you'd be right, we have. But that's the thing, they've been cultures, it's not been totally hedonistic. So, of course, hippie culture, but how many people actually partook in hippie culture? Small number of people, and then even fewer who would form those attempts at forming hippie communes. I mean, that was an even smaller subset of, hippies. So, pretty small subset ultimately. You might say, oh, well, what about for people who know their history, what about during the sort of 17th, 18th century? And you're right, people were, that was some pretty bawdy times, let me tell you. People seem to have this presupposition that people in the past were really prudish. They weren't. Really not. We're pretty prudish people these days. I mean, if you go back and you read the love letters between Catherine the Great of Russia, Empress of Russia, and Potemkin, her main lover, that's some saucy stuff. Legit. I'm not being sarcastic. That is some they're pretty explicit. They don't leave much to the imagination. Really, the Victorians and that whole modesty where they call each other cute names and that's snowflakes. Really, you're nothing. You're really just cutesy compared to what came before. Those guys were just sex crazed nutcases. But the point is, that was never the entire society. That was a very wealthy, basically group of people, the ruling class, who basically had more time on their hands than they knew what to do with, and so would copulate like eels. I mean, similar thing, you think of, famous in British memory, the Moulin Rouge in France, and basically, you had this very wealthy strata of British society with lots of money and lots of time on their hands that went and spent it cavorting in France. And I love it that French people often say, you lack the Moulin Rouge, but why don't you have one in England? It's because it wouldn't be the same. And that kind of is applied to that whole fantasy. And so the whole thing of encountering, we all engage, we all like that fantasy of coming across a hedonistic society and, jumping in and getting in on some of that good stuff. Even Zephram Cochrane, for goodness sake, I mean, what was the sum of his ambition? Use the Phoenix to retire to a tropical island filled with naked women. I mean, fair enough, but it's a fantasy. It's not really real. It's a bit of an unattainable. Really getting to that. Okay, so why are humans like that? Why don't we practice free love? Well, because when you try, well, it doesn't really last very long, because really it's just completely contradictory to what our biological state disposes us to. Humans are not really well disposed to free love, because actually humans take the whole thing of making more humans pretty damn seriously, and we kind of have to, because of the biological underpinnings that dictate us, right? So if you want to compare it to like fish, I mean, yeah, fish are pretty much, free love, basically here's some eggs, go for it, and why not? There's going to be lots of, so you have lots of eggs, they all get fertilized, but most will be eaten before they even stop being eggs, and most of the little fish that hatch out will also be eaten, and maybe one out of that entire load will actually survive. So, it's really just that kind of thing. You're just rolling the dice, but you do it so often, and there's so many of you that, you can afford to kind of take that blasé, roll of the dice biological attitude. Unfortunately, human reproduction is a lot more involved than that. And is, because a fish, it basically lays the eggs, get fertilized, and then bugger off and just leave the egg to, whatever happens. Right, and we don't. For us, it's a whole more involved thing. Right, so not only then, you've got to then carry the thing for 9 months, then you've got to raise it for upwards of, 16 years, if not more. It's a pretty involved process, making more humans. So it's pretty serious. And so the whole free love philosophy sort of breaks down when confronted with that reality, because ultimately you've got to, if you're a woman, and women do hold most of the power in the process, because ultimately they're the ones with the womb, they're the ones with the kit. But then also, okay, so as a male, well, you've got to be pretty involved as well. Okay, yeah, she's got to do a lot of work, but you've got to protect them all, because the kids are pretty much useless. She's pretty much impaired because she's got to look after the kids now, so she can't do a lot of stuff. You're going to have to do that stuff for them. And, okay, yeah, maybe you can bugger off, but okay, what happens if another male comes along and, as it happens in nature, just decides to kill off all of your kids because he was going to make sure that his genes are more successful? Well, there you go. Right. So it's evidently a very involved process for humans. And that's essentially why, ultimately, some cultures do practice polygamy, and that's generally a result of excess of resources. Generally, it's a sign of, wouldn't be frank, decadence. In an excellent book, actually, Things Fall Apart. Give it a read. It's quite short and very good. Anyway, it's about this African tribesman, sort of mid-19th century, just before colonists arrive, and he's a very well-respected man, and he's got 3 wives of varying age, and it's like, okay, but how has he ended up with that? Well, because basically he lives in a part of the world in which food grows on trees. It's basically the Garden of Eden, so he has more time to spend, protecting. He can actually viably protect his wives while still, partaking in the manual labour necessary to sustain them all. And, you've got an excess of resources, and you don't need extra men because life is pretty easy there. You don't need more people doing more labour. So, a lot of the time, they just take their pick of the strongest, and then the strongest get more wives, and thus you get a successively stronger generations, is kind of, I suppose, the cultural idea behind it. But it's still ultimately a committed relationship, and he has invested a lot in that. And he has the responsibility for them. So it's hardly a hedonistic society. What are the things that prevent humans from operating a hedonistic society? Basically, long gestation period, long growing period, the fact that we're completely useless when we're infants. That's about it. And the fact that it's 1 per litter, effectively 1 per birth. You're never having multiples, or you are, but it's extremely rare, or reasonably rare. Anyway, okay, so generally what we seem to understand, it seems to be that the more intelligent a creature is, the more useless it starts out as. And, like, obviously all things are useless when they start out, but the more kind of... I mean, you compare even a baby human to, say, let's say a baby horse, right? A baby horse is way better than a baby human, because, like, that foal will be up and moving in a couple minutes. It's going to take, like, months before a baby human is up and moving. I mean, horses are pretty smart comparatively to a lot of other things. You know, compare them to, like, fish. And, yeah, horses are pretty smart. So even they have kind of a useless period. You look at elephants, baby elephants, and basically a baby elephant spends its first few years looking like a very tasty, easy snack for some lions. And so it needs a lot of protection, a lot of guarding. And it's, you know, doubly, even more so the case for humans. So, okay, what does that mean for So what does that mean if we don't want to have that in a species? Well, okay, you're going to have to lower the intelligence ceiling. It's going to have to ultimately be a less intelligent species in order to basically have the necessary prerequisites for not really worrying about their young after they're born. Right, that their young can then be very quickly independent. Then secondly is going to be a gestation period. Again, you're going to have to just cut it down. And the same thing with the raising period. You're going to have to cut all that down in order to basically make it so that basically having kids is no biggie. It's just like it's like tribbles or rabbits. Tribbles are basically rabbits. They just do it, and it's just like whatever. Some will survive, probably. Yeah, but your biology is so well disposed to just churning out lots and lots of young that, you know, you don't really care, and so you go at it like rabbits. So where does that leave us with the whole idea of a species that is able to develop a hedonistic culture? Well, chances are they'd be dumb as soup. The other point would be you probably wouldn't want to engage in hedonism with them, because they probably wouldn't look good, because basically the look of the female is gonna just be, you know, disposed to carrying as many children as, you know, carrying and birthing as many children as possible, which, you know, don't look great. Let's be frank. And, you know, the males are gonna just be, we're just gonna look like any old crap, really, aren't they? Because there's no selection, there's no kind of selection process for the males. It's just, you know, luck of the draw, basically. Just, you know, who happens to show up first is like, well, you know, you'd be looking at a featherless peacock, effectively. You know, I mean, that's the whole thing. Is the peacock, male peacock has all its feathers and goes, hey, look at these feathers, girls, and, you know, they're all into that. But, you know, if it's just a case of really, they're just happy to have whoever shows up. It's like, he's not going to have feathers. What's the point of that? They're a hindrance. So the males aren't going to look particularly nice either. Where does that leave us? Well, I think it leaves us pretty much saying that, well, it's a nice fantasy to think about visiting a totally hedonistic society, and it's one that, you know, people do practice. Ultimately, it's an unsustainable fantasy, and, you know, if you're applying that to sci-fi, the likelihood of a species that is actually able to sustain that kind of society that would be anything remotely like us is extremely low. Like I say, you can have a hedonistic culture that is a result of certain circumstances and that is actually isolated to a small part of the population that is able to basically spend its time on that. But for the most part, you're never going to run into a species that is going to... You're never going to run into a species that is... that can copulate like rabbits, but at the same time still look as good as us, or that would even be as remotely smart as us. So yeah, those are my thoughts. and you know, some people might say the argument, well, you can, you know, if with the advancement of technology, and we can, you know, choose when and when not to have children and all of that. And it's like, yes, that's true, but ultimately the biological underpinning, your subconscious biological brain doesn't really know that, and it doesn't think about that. It's still playing the game of evolution. If you pretend not to be playing the game of evolution, then you're really just lying to yourself and in for a big shock because actually, it turns out you are playing game of evolution and you just don't know it. In any case, those are my thoughts on this, you know, cliche trope that we encounter in science fiction, and I wonder what you guys think of it. Let me know in the comments below. If you want more videos like this, where we talk about kind of the realism of potential alien cultures and all of that, let me know, because I'd be very interested in doing more. And I'll see you guys in the next video.